Hello, my name's Kayla, this is Cinnamon Peaches and Sage, and it is finally time for the long-awaited Pokemon Timeline video. This video is part 4 in my Pokemon Multiverse series. It has been a long time since I've released a video in this series, but it is one of my favorites, so I am super excited. If you've watched the previous videos in this series, you'll know that one of my common sayings in this series is that every single Pokemon game exists in a parallel universe with every other Pokemon game. By this I mean not only every Pokemon game by cartridge, but every individual save file. So for example, my save file of Pokemon Violet will be different than your save file of Pokemon Violet. Some people might say based on that creating a timeline for Pokemon is impossible. And while that is generally true, there are some events in Pokemon games that reoccur more frequently than others. We can use these relatively consistent events to construct a basic timeline of Pokemon. So when we're looking at this timeline, we need to understand that while these events typically occur in many universes, that doesn't mean they occur in all universes, and I'll point out some concrete examples that we have of that. Honestly, it's kind of one of the strengths of the Pokemon franchise because they don't have to worry so much about things being canonical across games. Alright, so we understand that this is a multiverse and that this timeline is not exact, but the next question is, where do we start this timeline? The answer might surprise you, but we actually need to go back beyond the creation of Pokemon games themselves to the childhood of Pokemon's creator, Satoshi Tajiri. Tajiri was born in 1965 and grew up in Machida, Tokyo. Back then, Machida had a lot more nature and wildlife, and Tajiri grew up collecting bugs. He was so fond of this hobby that he actually got the nickname Dr. Bug. But over time, Machida became more and more industrialized. Tajiri realized that other kids wouldn't be able to experience the childhood that he did. By 1981, Tajiri was really into arcade games and video games. He actually founded the magazine Game Freak, which would later be used as the name for his company. This was a magazine about video games before there were magazines about video games, or like online things about video games. Like, this was very new for its time. Ken Sugimori saw his magazine and agreed to illustrate it. He would later become the artist for many of the Pokemon that we know and love today. 1990 was when Tajiri first came up with the idea for Pokemon. One of his inspirations for Pokemon happened when he was playing Dragon Quest II with a friend. His friend got 2 of a rare item drop, and Tajiri got none. They talked about using a link cable to transfer the item from one game to another. Tajiri, being inspired by bug collecting as a child, thought it would be so cool to have a video game where you played as a child collecting creatures, and then you were able to trade those creatures with friends using the newly developed link cable. Why is this so important? Well, it shows that the Pokemon Multiverse was established before the games were even created. This idea of having these 2 games, these 2 pocket universes that people could trade between, was an establishing idea of the franchise. It's not like they came along later and were like, oh, it would be really cool if this was a multiverse. No, it was part of the initial foundation of Pokemon games. This is further highlighted by what they decided to name the franchise. Originally, Pokemon was going to be called Capsule Monsters. That's actually where the name of my channel comes from, Kayla's Capsule. The games were renamed Pocket Monsters or Pokemon because you were able to put these creatures in your pocket and carry them with you. In other words, Pokemon games have always designed to be pocket universes. A pocket universe is a tiny contained universe that exists within a larger universe. Theoretically, pocket universes could be interacted with either through portals or other technological transfer mechanisms. So for example, putting a game cartridge in a Game Boy and then also linking up your Game Boy to another person's Game Boy. These are examples of us in the real world interacting with a simulated pocket universe. But you can imagine how presenting the idea of bug collecting, trading, and pocket universes might be a little confusing to Nintendo executives. At first, when Tajiri presented his ideas for Pokemon, he was met with a lot of confusion. Fortunately, Shigeru Miyamoto heard Tajiri's idea and saw the potential in it. He helped mentor Tajiri so that Pokemon was able to get off the ground. When Pokemon Red and Green released in Japan in 1996, the Game Boy was not doing very well. It was kind of expected that the Pokemon games were going to fail. But without telling Nintendo, Tajiri made one brilliant move. Tajiri secretly coded in Mew into Pokemon Red and Green. Rumors spread like crazy about hidden Pokemon beyond the original 150. This led to people playing the games even more to try to find hidden exploits. All of these events led up to the creation of the Pokemon Multiverse. But why is this important to the games themselves? Well, we as observers of this pocket universe understand that these games were created in this way. The people within the games don't understand that they're living in a pocket universe. They don't know how their universe is connected to ours. Because Pokemon games are canonically pocket universes, they have a lot of references to our reality. The games are meta for a reason. We also have situations in Pokemon where Pokemon are used to represent concepts within this pocket universe. Some of the obvious ones are Arceus, who even has a cutscene showing real world images. Arceus is one of many. There is not just one Arceus. They are all part of this larger concept, and they represent collective imagination. Basically, all of the different things from the real world that inspired Tajiri and the other people who create Pokemon games. Arceus embodies the imagination, and the unknown, the arms of Arceus, embody the code used to actually create the games. What other forces are needed in a pocket universe for it to make sense? Well, we definitely need space so that we can place pixels on the screen in the appropriate places, and we also need time so that we're able to move through the different places in the pocket universe. Enter Dialga and Palkia. We need Giratina as well, antimatter, gravity, the spaces in between that we may not necessarily see when we're playing the game, aka the distortion realm, an area where things are not quite as they seem and they are storing different assets that we may never see. In Pokemon lore, Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf were created next. They represent knowledge, emotions, and willpower. 3 things that gamers desperately need in order to be successful. Without what the Lake Guardians represent, you can't really play a game. On top of that, characters need a world to interact with. They need ground from Groudon, they need water from Kyogre, and they need sky from Rayquaza. But they don't just need these things in random places, so we need Regigigas and Heatran to make sure everything is in the right place. And finally, after all of this is in place, we need Pokemon. And that's where we get what is considered the ancestor to all Pokemon, Mew. Mew is described, and also works mechanically, as having very unstable DNA, allowing Mew to utilize moves of different types. It makes sense that a Pokemon like this could turn into many other different species. These different species started to come to be during prehistory. This is when you see a lot of the fossil Pokemon, and it's also the time when AI Professor Sada traveled back to. One thing to keep in mind about prehistory is that if our world is any judge of how long this period was, it was probably a really long time. The reason I'm saying this is because I don't want people in the comments to go, oh, was Amora around in the same time as these Paradox Pokemon? Probably not. Like, look up what dinosaurs could not possibly have interacted with each other and your mind will be blown. But anyways, the oldest confirmed event in the Pokemon timeline is the creation of the crater in Paldea. This was said to have occurred 1 million years ago. That is a very, very long time ago. For those of you, myself included, that were kind of hoping that the crater of Paldea was formed by the ultimate weapon, that doesn't make sense on the timeline. So unless Pokemon SV has a very different timeline than Pokemon X and Y, it seems pretty unlikely that this crater was caused by the ultimate weapon. And I know I'm guilty of speculating that before the games came out as well. I feel like everyone did, but it's basically proven to be false at this point. Then we have another very significant time jump, like an extremely long amount of time. But 20,000 years ago, a meteorite containing Eternatus fell onto the Galar region. You'll notice that meteors tend to be a theme in Pokemon, though whether or not they fall in the same places in every universe is very much up to debate. For example, based on text within the games, we know that this meteor fell in Galar in Pokemon Sword and Shield, as well as in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, but we have no confirmation that this meteor fell in Galar in any of the other Pocket universes. Alright, another big time jump. 3,000 years ago, this is when AZ fired the ultimate weapon. Or did he? Whether or not AZ fired the ultimate weapon is considered a huge divergent event in the timeline. Some universes where AZ fired the ultimate weapon have Megastones. Universes where AZ did not fire the ultimate weapon do not have Megastones. This gets more complicated though, because just because the Megastones aren't in a game doesn't mean that Megastones don't exist in other regions. This complication makes it impossible to say with 100% certainty that what I call the classic timeline exists separately from the Mega timeline. But for the sake of argument, it's easier to assume that if there's no Megastones in the game, AZ probably didn't fire the ultimate weapon, especially when we have Kanto games without Megastones and with Megastones. Also around 3,000 years ago was when the Darkest Day occurred in Galar, which was stopped by Zacian and Zamazenta. So basically we know that it took about 17,000 years for Eternatus to fully power up to the point that the Darkest Day happened. This gives us somewhat of a timeline around what Rose was talking about. I definitely want to look into that more in a future video. Anyways, 2,000 years ago, Groudon and Kyogre got into their fight, which was stopped by Rayquaza. Interestingly, it probably occurred 2,000 years ago only in the classic timeline without Mega Evolution. More evidence on that in a little bit. Also around 2,000 years ago is when the Paldean Empire was formed. This led to a lot of exploration into the Great Crater of Paldea. 1,000 years ago is when the first writing system was implemented in the Pokemon world. This is also around the same time as the Celestica people, and I think it's highly implied that they may have been the ones who created that writing system, especially since this was also the time of the ancient hero, so it's entirely possible that they may have come into contact with Arceus and the Unknown. As I said previously, the fight between Groudon and Kyogre that was calmed by Rayquaza happened in a different time, probably in the Mega timeline, which seems to occur 1,000 years ago. What about the Mega timeline caused their fight to occur 1,000 years later? I honestly have no idea, but if you do, let me know in the comments. 800 years ago, we have the founding of either Naranja or Uva Academy. This is also when Xerneas or Yveltal released their life energy and entered their dormant state. 700 years ago in Ecruteak City, the Bell and Brass Towers were constructed, Lugia and Ho-Oh perched atop them. 500 years ago, the Island Guardians protected the region of Alola. About 200 years ago was when Heath led his expedition into the Great Crater of Paldea. And then 150 years ago, the Brass Tower burned down, causing the death of 3 Pokemon that were resurrected as a legendary beast. Now we're moving into more modern history, and by modern history, I'm talking about events that we actually got to experience in the games. While not all of these events we experienced directly in the games, these are events that are a little bit closer to what would be considered present day. My previous videos in the Pokemon Multiverse Explained series place all of these other games, but if you want me to also make a video placing Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, let me know in the comments. I'm also not going to go over all of the events within games, but I'm doing this for a reason. Depending on the version of the game you played, the events that you experience might be slightly different. The game Pokemon Legends Arceus occurred about 100 years ago. About 87 years ago, research facilities were established in Area Zero. From about 48 to 30 years ago, Mustard was the champion of Galar. Shortly after that, at about 27 years ago, Giovanni founded Team Rocket and created Mewtwo. Mewtwo basically destroyed Cinnabar Mansion and made its way to Cerulean Cave. 10 years after that, about 17 years ago, we see the events of the original Pokemon games. But this does not include the Let's Go remakes of these games. Similar to what happened with Groudon, Kyogre, and Rayquaza, the Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee games take place at a later point in the timeline than the classic timeline games. Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald also occur about 17 years ago, but Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire also occur later because they are Mega timeline games. About 14 years ago, we get the events of Gold, Silver, Crystal, and their remakes. We also get the events of Diamond, Pearl, Platinum, and their remakes as well. About 10 years ago, Turo and or Sada create their time machine and then are killed by either Koraidon or Miraidon. 4 years ago, we get the Mega Timeline version of the original games and Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, as well as the Mega Timeline versions of the Gen 3 games, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. Pokemon Black and White occur around this time as well. A lot happened 2 years ago. We get Pokemon Black and White 2, Pokemon X and Y, and Pokemon Sword and Shield. Finally, in the so-called present day, we get all of the Alola games as well as Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. Lastly, based on how far we know AI Sada travels back in time, we can estimate that AI Turo travels greater than 1 million years into the future. So yeah, that is the entire Pokemon timeline. As I said, it gets very complicated because just because these events generally occur, it doesn't mean that they occur in every single universe, meaning certain games might have different events in them from others. Fortunately, many of the events are reoccurring, allowing us to create this basic timeline. What do you think of this timeline? Do you think I placed any of the events in the wrong order? Let me know in the comments. Make sure to like, subscribe, and join our Discord, Capsule Monsters, where we talk about Pokemon theories and strategy. I hope you have a great day or night, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!